Most people really misunderstand what it is. It is nothing to do with being a poor country. If it was, then why are Saudi Arabia in there? So if a country is called Third World now, it means that it's poor, right? Even though this is complete bullshit, as we'll get into. But when it was termed, it meant anything but that. Sure, some of those countries were poor, and we'll get into why later. But what it really has to do with is the Cold War. Now, why the Cold War? So the end of World War II has happened. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan have been crushed. At the same time, America and the USSR are really growing. UK and France, the former big colonial empires, are falling apart. They're riddled with debt. They can't really sustain their own national economies anymore, let alone potentially keep up with armies and other resources to keep control of their colonies. But they aren't necessarily willing to let many of them go. Sure, India gets independence almost immediately after World War II, which is a whole mess, which we won't get into here, but deserves its own video. France is a bit more belligerent in general. In Vietnam, they fight back against Ho Chi Minh to try and keep control of it. Ultimately, this is fruitless, but it will take a long time before that gets resolved and ultimately ends up with the US joining the Vietnam War and taking up France's role. So you can see how these things are all highly interdependent. The USSR and the USA are taking control of world politics, really. They now have nuclear weapons. They are pretty economically dominant. The USA is effectively bankrolling the likes of the UK and France because they can't really afford to meet their basic obligations. And it's this kind of bankrolling that allows them to keep hold of their empires for a bit longer. But as we'll see, tensions rise in certain places, and that causes a snowball effect. At the same time, the USSR and the USA have always been vaguely anti-colonial, at least in their rhetoric. They talk a good game about not being colonial when both of them really are colonial empires. And so independence for many of the nations that are ruled especially by, say, France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, the few remaining Spanish colonies, and a few others, their independence is hard fought for. And it's a long time coming. Although we see a rapid acceleration of independent countries after World War II, especially between, I think, the late 50s and mid 60s, there's almost a quadrupling of the number of countries that are out there. This is a long process that starts way before. Many of them are schooled by the likes of the USSR, which pre-World War II was looking to weaken some of its rivals' empires, for instance. There's all kinds of action, direct, indirect, by the people looking to get independence. You have Gandhi, obviously, who was famously peaceful. You have the likes of Ho Chi Minh, who's a lot more, shall we say, belligerent. And yeah, you kind of have these movements happening all over, especially Asia and Africa, other places as well. But the majority of what we're going to end up speaking about and what ends up being called the Third World is in Asia and Africa. Now, the USA has its allies. Obviously, we've already mentioned Britain and France. They are pretty much locked into the USA's orbit. Although it's not clear immediately, they can't really do much without the USA's involvement. And there's a particular incident we'll get to soon that will demonstrate that. The USSR also has its own semi-allies. People's Republic of China, which had become communist as well. And at first, they're extremely close to each other. That itself will change and does have consequences both for the Cold War and for the Third World. Again, we'll get to later. But you have these two power blocks. And I guess you could call the first one, led by the USA, the First World. And you could call the second one, led by the USSR, the Second World. Now, all of these countries are becoming independent, or have at least independence movements. And as they're building their independence movements, they can see that the likes of the USSR and the USA are trying to influence them towards their side. Now, this could be for many reasons. It could be because they're in a geopolitically interesting location that one of those powers wants to have, say, a military base in. As we can see, there are many bases around the world that currently have US militaries in. These places may be rich in natural resources, maybe some oil, maybe certain minerals that will be very important for the world economy in the future, or even at the time, but definitely now. One of the others may be that they already have these resources themselves, but the USA in particular can be very paranoid about certain resources falling into the USSR's hands, or them or their allies being locked out as a result of the USSR getting involved. There's all kinds of reasons why they may be interested. So there's a lot of external pressure on these groups, and maybe some incentives, dangled carrots for people to grab onto, and maybe that will set them up for success in their movement or for when they're independent. But you have to put yourself in the mind of these people who are going independent. They have spent potentially half a decade or more, and their ancestors, fighting for their independence. And they've seen the effect of colonialism on them. Most of it's been extractivist. They've had all their resources taken away from them, or in the case of like India, you've seen like a complete economic sham to keep the British economy going for many centuries. So they have not seen any direct benefit of this capitalist system that the USA says is going to be good for them. So you can kind of see their point of view, right? It kind of makes sense from their point of view. They've not seen any upsides, they've only seen downsides. They've only been the people downtrodden by the system, not the people on the top of the system treading other people down. At the same time, they can also see that the USSR, especially under Stalin, it was different before Stalin and will be different after Stalin. But during Stalin's time, which obviously he was a heck of a dictator, and he didn't really care about the welfare of these countries. He only really cared about whether he could influence and dominate Europe, because he saw that as like the true prize. So you then have a lot of countries who are getting a lot of external pressure, but don't see any of it as positive. They see it as mostly very negative. And as I said, by the early 50s, there aren't that many independent countries yet that have come from colonies, but the movements are building. But in 1952, there's the Egyptian Revolution, which is led by Nasser. Now, Nasser is a figure that, again, and this whole period of Egyptian history probably deserves its whole own video. But because of how important he is and Egypt is to the spread of the movements that come, we need to focus on them briefly here. So the Egyptian Revolution happens. Now, Egypt is, again, even just this period of Egyptian history is very important, but the whole, at least 50 years before this, could be studied in detail because it had been effectively a British colony. The Suez Canal in particular was very important for world trade and was becoming more and more important over time. Britain and France had controlling interests in this. There was a king in Egypt that was a bit too pally and a bit too friendly with these imperial powers, and people like Nasser decided enough was enough. They launched a coup and take control. Now, he's a very charismatic leader, and he genuinely has the best interests of the Egyptian people at heart. So first he takes control of the country, and then a few years later, in 1956, he takes control of the Suez Canal. He's giving a speech, and he's already given his army a special keyword that if they hear it said, that's the launch of the operation. The speech itself doesn't really give anything away that this is about to happen. So Britain and France are about to be caught very off guard. And he says the word, the Egyptian military take control. Britain and France are furious. But this is where we find that they have certain limitations. They concoct a plan with the relatively newly created state of Israel. Israel is going to invade and make it look like those two are against it. So Britain and France are against the Israeli invasion. They're not. They are going to then intervene for the sake of peace. They're going to be peacekeepers, and then they're just going to come in and restore it back to the status quo. That is basically the plan. Israel gets to flex some muscle, maybe take a bit of territory at the same time. Win-win. So Israel invades, Britain and France arrive later, and everything's going to plan. That is until Dwight Eisenhower, the US president, hears about it. So he was given zero heads up about what was about to happen. And consider that his government is effectively bankrolling France and Britain. He tells them to leave. He then threatens them with economic consequences that basically make them bankrupt. He threatens to sell all of the British pounds that the US holds in reserve and use that to crash the value of the pound, for instance. Anthony Eden, the UK Prime Minister at the time, is forced into a humiliating pullback, basically. France is pretty similar. They try and be a bit more belligerent, but ultimately decide they have no choice but to withdraw. Eisenhower had this to say as well about what happened. Israel was a bit more belligerent, and Eisenhower also said this about them. It would be funny if a US president would take that kind of stance now, wouldn't it? I mean, Eisenhower was far from perfect. He has a lot of the villain arc in this story, really, if there has to be one, because he ends up being president during a pretty critical time. But he's kind of an angel and devil at the same time. He will ultimately do things that may push certain countries to get their independence and maintain their independence, but then will also do certain things that will keep people under their colonial thumb. So, a complicated figure. But this crisis is massive. Egypt ultimately gets to keep control of the Suez Canal and gets their independence from the colonial powers. The USA has basically told the UK and France they can't do this kind of thing without their permission. Doesn't mean this sort of thing won't happen. It just means at least tell them and maybe get the CIA involved or something. I don't know. But the bigger effect is arguably outside of Egypt. You now have a lot of countries that have either just become independent or about to become independent, and they have seen what the colonial powers will do if you don't do what they want. They know that the threat of, say, a Britain or France invading, or the USA or the USSR, could happen. Like, it's not out of the question. Similar things are happening all over the world. that very year, the Bandung Conference happens. This is a collection of a lot of countries that have gone independent and are about to be. And anyone who's not explicitly part of the Cold War, so not explicitly allied with the USSR or the USA. So it's quite a big tent of countries. The dominant figures there end up being Nasser from Egypt, you get Nehru from India, newly independent as well, and you get the president of Indonesia, whose name I can't remember, which is slightly embarrassing. They end up being pretty dominant figures there. A lot of the communications that come from the conference are very anti-colonialist, anti-Cold War. They are full of hope for cooperation between these countries to build a better future for their people and more security for their people and more independence for their people. Solidarity is a big part of it, and explicitly rejecting anything to do with the Cold War. A lot of anti-American sentiment there, which is not really that much of a surprise. But certain countries, I think like Japan and a few others that are there, are a bit annoyed by how anti-American everything is, but that's how it goes. Those three end up being pretty dominant and inspirational and charismatic, and that's kind of the thing that carries the day. Now, interestingly, China is also there, and they send their prime minister, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, and everyone's a bit wary of China because they are explicitly communist and they do seem to love the USSR, at least at this point. They want cooperation with the rest of the world. They're not there to try and convert everyone to communism. They're just there to try and be friendly, I guess, at this stage. There's still some mistrust because, yeah, they're explicitly communist and explicitly allied with the USSR. So they're kind of frozen out of things. But the main message is solidarity between these countries. And it's around this time as well that the name Third World really starts to take effect. So as we said, we've got First World, which is effectively capitalism, Second World, which is communism. And the reason that this kind of naming is even come up with in the first place has something to do with the French Revolution. So to sum it up really quickly, during the French Revolution, a lot changed in France, for instance, and a lot changed about the political system that kind of haunts a lot of modern political systems at the same time. Traditionally in France, you had the nobles and the clergy, and they held most of the political power outside of the king. And if a session of effectively a parliament was called for France, or I can't remember the name that the French used for their parliament, but anyway. So say a parliament is called. Those groups would usually be called in, those would be the ones making the majority of the decisions along with the king. But during the French Revolution, there was a huge demand for a third estate. So you had the clergy and the nobles, which are the first and second estate. And there's a huge demand for a third estate, which is representation of all the people that aren't represented by those two groups. So, you know, the majority of the population. After a lot of arguing and certain violent incidents, that happens. So taking inspiration from that, that's kind of where this nomenclature comes from. It's that you have a first and second estate, or first and second world, and then you're bringing in this third world, this much larger group of people that are completely unrepresented by the current world order. So that's why this name comes about. It's not an insult at first. If anything, it's given to them by themselves. And everything they do from this point onwards is to try and make this a strong block of countries and to work together to make a better world. So the Bandung Conference finishes and everyone's feeling pretty happy about it. From this point forwards, the rate of independence for certain countries accelerates rapidly. But one country we could look at in particular, which might be really instructive, is Congo. So Congo was a Belgian colony and one of the most brutal, savage colonies ever invented. Again, the history of Congo and its importance both in the past and now, fully deserved. But we're just going to talk about their independence, which was a mess. There has been international condemnation of Belgians' treatment of the Congolese for around 40 or 50 years by the time they get independence. So in 1960, they get independence. And it is a sudden independence, which you may think is a good thing, but not really. There are 16 university graduates in the entire country. There are no teachers, barely any doctors, barely any roads, no large political parties. The military is almost non-existent, virtually no military officers. Good or bad, all of these are signs that Belgium had intentionally kept all power and all control for themselves, which they absolutely did. It was one of the most brutal extractivist colonies of all time. And as soon as they withdrew, they knew there would be a power vacuum. And they almost did it out of spite. Into this void steps Patrice Lumumba, a former postal clerk, who's now the prime minister. The Belgians hate him, and they start lobbying for other people to oppose him. They do anything to support anyone else who will make sure that they control loads of the industry that's left behind. That's very important to them. And the USA under Eisenhower think that he's probably a bit too close to the USSR. He isn't explicitly communist, for the record. He's very nationalist, understandable, given that he's been the target, him and his country have been the target of a huge colonial campaign. Yeah, the USA and the CIA, etc., within it are pretty convinced he's a soft communist, and so aren't really willing to do anything to help him. Now, given all of the lack of people who are educated, all of the lack of infrastructure within the country, etc., it was very difficult for him to keep control of the country, and it starts to fall apart. He requests UN support to help him keep the country stable. Now, peacekeepers arrive, but it doesn't really do anything. Nothing's getting better. He's been dealt a very bad hand, and especially when you consider that there's no help coming from the USA and Belgium is actively working against him. So at this point, he feels he has no option but to publicly ask the USSR for help. And this is a USSR that is post-Stalin. So now Khrushchev is in charge. He tries to turn back the clock to when the USSR used to be more international looking and more willing to cooperate with the rest of the world, but also not go back to when they used to lecture people about how they should run their countries. Maybe to go more back towards the education model where they educate certain leaders, etc., but they're not necessarily saying this is the only way you have to be, and if you don't, we won't help you. So this public request comes in and Khrushchev is in charge and he's like, yeah, we'll help you. And a USSR aid package starts to be put together. You also then have countries like Ghana and Egypt, which are also recently independent and willing to help as well. So all this is being worked on in the background. Great. Lumumba is going to get some assistance in holding the country together. The USA decides, no, this is completely unacceptable. What if the USSR gets hold of all the precious resources in Congo? So Congo has loads of natural minerals, which are now very important, say, for computing and battery-based products and things like that, but also rubber was one of the original things they were exploited for. And the USA is a bit worried about that stuff getting to the hands of the USSR, or exclusively in the hands of the USSR. So they're not willing to take a risk that the Congo would just become like the USSR's colony. And they put together a little coup using the CIA, obviously, because that's what they do. That's kind of what they're there for. And the wheels are put into motion. And then there's a coup, but not backed by the CIA. The military takes things into their own hands and Lumumba's gone. They hand him over to his enemies, and then 3 months later, he turns up dead. He's been murdered. Yeah, it's a very sad episode because it feels like any kind of cooperation from the world could have helped the Congolese people, but instead a selfish power game was played instead. And Congo, to this day, is not a very stable place. Again, because of international interference. The Congo incident is kind of important for a couple of reasons. They've had the Bandung Conference, and there's all of these countries that are starting to call themselves the third world or various other things, want this kind of solidarity with each other. They want to help newly independent countries to rise up together. But then they see this happen, and Egypt and Ghana in particular see it and think, there's nothing we could have done. Like, we wanted to help them, but we don't have enough resources ourselves to be able to do anything about this. And we'll get back onto why that's important in a second. And the USSR thinks, damn, there's nothing we could have done either, because we can't really project power that far. And it's kind of a wake-up call for them that the Americans can potentially do that kind of thing much more easily than they can. And it kind of sets them back in terms of how can they help countries, even if they're genuinely, you can question the motives or whatever, but like, say they want to help, how can they actually help? That starts to become a bigger question, like what can they actually do realistically halfway across the world from where they are? So it kind of sets up, so you have the Suez Crisis and then you have this crisis, which kind of show different things. You have one that shows the weakness of the former colonial powers, now you have this one that shows the weakness of these third world countries to actually do anything, or even the USSR to do much when the Americans are trying to plot something. And the Western world is generally against a certain country or leader. And this is very much a playbook that plays out multiple times. If the UK or France are struggling with a colony, there's lots of rebellion, one thing they'll often say to the USA or to their president when speaking to them is that those rebels are communists. Now, the CIA may be a terrible organization that often looks to kill people and launch coups all over the world just to turn things slightly towards the Americans, only to then slap them in the face later when they do, that country then turns against the Americans for that interference. But anyway, that's a whole other topic, but they're generally not completely incompetent in terms of their intelligence, in terms of finding out information. And the UK and France will be telling the American president or Secretary of State, etc., that these people are bad, they're communists, and it's completely justifiable to attack them because of this fact. And they know that that's how you play the USA. You say that they're communists and they'll be like, fine, do what you need to do. The CIA, though, will say, no, they're not. Like, we already have information on these people. They're definitely not. They're not even speaking to Moscow. But at that stage, it doesn't really matter. The UK and France will just go for it. Algeria is another good example of something happening in the world that's quite important. Probably going to get a bit sick of me saying this, but their whole independence movement and their colonialization as well in the first place is kind of a really special case and probably needs its own video to get into the depths of. But the fact is, by the end of World War II, a lot of Algerian people are very keen for the French to leave. Now, Algeria is quite different to, say, most colonies that existed in the world at the time. The UK, with the exception of, say, Ireland, wasn't too close to many of its colonies, and they were often like much further away, and so culturally would often be quite different. You wouldn't really try and settle them or anything like that with your own people, your own culture, etc. More than just what you needed to rule. Anyway, Algeria is kind of different in the case of France because they share the Mediterranean Sea with them. So the south of France and Algeria aren't that far away from each other, and there's a big effort to populate Algeria with as many French people as possible. And there's a good chunk of the population that is French, but the majority is, of course, Algerian. From the end of World War II onwards, they're fighting for independence. They think that for fighting on the Allies' side and helping to get rid of the Nazis, that they're going to be granted independence, and that does not happen. There's a whole massacre that happens in Seti and a few other places that a previous video of mine gets into, actually. That happens, the FLN, which is the rebel movement against colonial France, rises up, starts fighting back. This is all happening in the 40s and 50s. During much of the 50s, they take control of a lot of the country. France almost goes through like an existential crisis as a result of this. Loads of military officers launch a coup and from France, launch a coup and say they want Charles de Gaulle to come back and take control and really rein the Algerians in. So he comes in, brutal military tactics take place, truly horrific things, crimes against humanity, awful, awful things happen, all in the name of just keeping hold of this piece of land. This happens, but it doesn't work. The FLN, the Algerians, really, really want their independence. They really want the French people gone. They have something to fight for. And you'll see this a lot in a lot of stories of independence or similar situations like the Vietnam War, etc. Those that really want it and have some reason for doing the fighting are more likely to outlast the people that don't, even if they have superior militaries or technology and various other things. This can be a very important factor. Eventually, the USA says to France, enough is enough. Like, this looks bad. Like, we're supporting you and you are committing huge crimes. France kind of doesn't want to stop, but they eventually do. Under de Gaulle, they reluctantly give Algeria its independence. So they are also part of this third world network of countries. And this brings us to the next major conference, which is in 1960. This was actually 1961, not 1960. And this is the birth of the non-aligned movement, which is basically just another way of talking about what we refer to as the third world countries. But this is interesting because it's 4 years after Bandung, and you have many of the same people involved, but now you've got even more independent countries because in those 4 years, loads more independent countries have been created, e.g. Congo that we've just talked about, or Ghana, and various other places. It's a couple of years later, but interestingly, the vibe has kind of shifted amongst these people. You previously had lots of talk of like racial solidarity, so kind of stamping out racism and structural inequality between races and that kind of thing. That starts to disappear, and it's more about just general solidarity, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just interesting that in those 4 years, something could have switched so much, but hey, it is what it is. Interestingly, this non-aligned movement still exists now. It's not really talked about, because it's a pretty loose grouping of countries, but it is the largest grouping of countries outside of the UN itself. They're far more concerned with the practical realities, like opposing military bases in their countries, and just being more anti-colonial. That's like the main priority. They've kind of widened the tent and therefore had to like dilute some of the specific things they were talking about, but everyone taking part thinks it's still a worthwhile endeavor. And interestingly, in this group, you have the likes of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So you're not really talking about a like very leftish or particularly radical group of leaders and countries now. There are still many in that group that are, but you're starting to see other people in there who aren't like that. But they're all concerned about the Cold War and its effect on them, their people, their countries, their stability, their safety. And so we reach the beginning of the end of the Third War. And It has some predictable causes and some slightly less predictable. By the mid-60s, you've got all of these newly independent countries. So as we've said, around 4 times more independent countries than there were in 1945. So that's great. You have a lot more people who have a lot more self-determinism. They have a lot more control over their politics and their economies and their way of life, at least in theory. Some of them are starting from a very low base, having been colonized, so it's going to take them a long time before they can have an economy that's going to really work for them. If you don't have some kind of very profitable natural resource in your country, then you're probably going to struggle. It's a big bonus point if you've found oil in your country, e.g. Algeria does. But Algeria is an interesting one because it's a good microcosm of everything that's going to happen during the 60s and 70s. The FLN takes control, and oil has been found and can start being extracted and being sold, and average growth in the country is actually quite good in the aftermath of independence. But the oil is kind of hiding the bigger problems. Nearly everything else is in decline, so the oil is just really covering up for decline elsewhere. They've tried to redistribute land to make it more fair, but then there's been a loss of expertise, so you get things like food shortages, which cause price increases. So people's standard way of living gets worse. People start to be more conservative with their spending and all kinds of things. So understandably, they don't feel secure. Their leader, Ben Allah, becomes increasingly dictatorial because he realizes that the world he wants isn't going to work, and he's kind of sick of the criticism he's getting, and people are demanding more and more, and he's like, what can I do? This is no way excusing what he did. But anyway, not necessarily like the worst dictator of all time, but, you know, classic controlling the press, that kind of thing. So they're kind of stuck in a rut. Even though they've got a resource that's profitable and valuable, their country is not doing well. This isn't universally the case amongst all of these countries, but it's kind of a good example of what could happen to certain countries. And by 1965, there's going to be like the next conference to decide on direction, that kind of thing. So we've had 1956 in Bandung, we had 1961 in Belgrade, and now we have 1965 in Algeria. So everything's set up, ready to go. But 1965 ends up being a bit of a big year for the movement. So in Algeria itself, Ben Allah is overthrown, and over in Indonesia, which had also been a big part of the movement, the leftist government and parties are overthrown and become much worse. A little sprinkling of genocide over there in the intervening years between then and now. And a similar thing happens in Congo. So you had slightly more left-leaning governments there, and again, they're overthrown. All of this means that the 1965 conference never happens. It's kind of a phantom conference. It was going to be the future, and then it ends up being kind of a relic of the past. And it isn't just these overthrowings of more leftist-leaning people that are the primary causes. As I've said, you've seen in many countries that there hasn't been like a direct benefit yet of being independent, partially through interference, partially through many different reasons. It some ways is this video, but it kind of deserves its own special thing. Like, what made it so hard for these countries to recover from centuries or decades of being under the thumb of somebody else and having their resources extracted? I mean, it's kind of obvious on some levels, but it kind of deserves more of a deep dive in future. All we need to know for the purposes of this are that leaders are under pressure to improve people's lives, one way or the other. It's in this period that a lot of former or current military people start taking control in a lot of these places, and they start to value stability, order, steadiness over revolutionary movements, which you can see the attraction to. Not all of these people get to power democratically, actually, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in these places wanted these things to happen. However, this is what happens. Even when they're not military dictatorships, a lot of these countries start to realize that they can't really do anything if their own economy is no good. And you see this all over the place. You'll see it in places like Egypt, India, Pakistan, Ghana. You'll see it basically everywhere. They think they need to increase their economy in order to get the world to where they want it to be. But more specifically, they're looking at a more inward direction. They're looking at what can I do for my people, and if there's a benefit for other people, then so be it. But really, things go to a much more nationalist swing from an internationalist one before. It's not necessarily like everyone gets together and decides this is the case. It's just what slowly starts to happen. You then get a lot of countries that were part of the third world start to peel away, and they'll get pulled in one direction or the other towards the USSR or towards the USA, all to get some kind of assistance with growing their economies and getting stability and these kind of things. And generally both were willing to help, especially if it meant that there was some upside for them in the long run. So this is kind of how the third world ends. It's that self-interest becomes the overriding factor. You also have certain other elements. So in a lot of the Arabic world during this time, there are secular governments. They're not particularly theocratic in any way. I guess what most people would call Islamist governments now. They weren't particularly Islamist governments then. As these people have seen not much benefit from what's come, as is the case in a lot of systems, especially ones that go democratic in some way, you will find there's usually a reaction against whoever's in power. If things aren't getting better, or standards are getting worse, or your life feels worse, you're going to probably turn to some other direction. And again, it's not really a coordinated thing, it just starts to happen. A lot of the Arabic world starts to move towards Islamist governments and much more theocratic governments. This is a longish process, but you can really see it start to happen during the 60s, especially during the 70s, culminating in things like the Iranian Revolution, which goes from being a fairly secular government, not very popular one, and probably too Western and too friendly to the Americans, to the complete opposite direction, which is Ayatollah Khomeini and hatred of the West and everything to do with it, and much more explicitly Islamist and theocratic. I don't want to make broad assertions, but in the case of Iran, that system has not worked out very well for the people. But you see this a lot around the Middle East and North Africa, etc. You start to see the rise of Islamist parties, a lot more power, and you see more solidarity amongst Muslims. No bad thing, but it almost comes at the expense of non-Muslims. So yes, that's like the other big force that changes in the world, that starts to move everything away from the hope that everyone had of working together. That solidarity just starts to disappear. You then start to see clashes between these formerly aligned countries because one owns resources that the other needs, and one is, say, joining an organization like OPEC and restricting the flow of oil to keep the price up, but the other one needs oil prices to be low to keep up their own production. You can see all kinds of economic self-interest getting in the way. All of this means that, yeah, the third world kind of dissolves. There's no big event, although 1965 is really important. It just kind of disappears and then becomes like a memory of what things were like, almost like a dream of what things could have been like. It was probably, in my opinion, this is more my opinion than anything else, not necessarily a bad idea, but they were starting from a terrible place. A lot of them were recently independent after colonialism. A lot of extraction had already happened in their country. There was already a lot of deprivation in their country, lack of infrastructure, lack of knowledge about how to extract resources, as can be seen in Iraq, as you can see in one of my previous videos as well. I find that it was an interesting movement to have happened when it happened, but it probably would have worked out better later, if that makes sense. But in a way, it never could have. The 1970s onwards see like a massive switch in the world economy. Things get weird for a long time and are still weird economically as a result of that period. Yeah, you start to see a lot of the oil-rich countries exerting their power from that point onwards. You obviously eventually see the collapse of the USSR, which then means there's no real balancing force against the USA. You only really got the first world in that system. And even the likes of China, which was always on the fence to a degree during the Cold War, but then starts to become very anti-USSR. And then under Nixon, bizarrely, Mao decides to meet him and, be relatively friendly, because that's how much he ends up hating the USSR. So China ends up being a bit of a strange one. China obviously moves away from its explicitly communist roots to a more planned capitalist economy, basically. I think that's how I'd refer to it, but other people can chime in what you would call the Chinese system. But that from the 70s onwards, that's when things start to change. And by the 90s, there's no USSR, there's only really the USA, and it's kind of a unipolar world for 30 years. It's arguable that that has ended now, but in that world that we've been living in until the last few years, there's been no real room for that kind of movement. You could argue that we're again in a moment where something like that could work. I'm not saying it should, but I'm just saying it could, because I don't think China, in my opinion, open to arguments against this opinion, is as aggressive externally as the USSR was at times. But it is certainly the rising power that USSR would have hoped it would have become itself, right? And it does invest a lot in other countries. It has the whole Belt and Road Initiative. I haven't really checked on the progress of that in the last few years, but I imagine it's still happening. A lot of formerly third world countries are getting investment from China. And this is exactly at a point where the USA is starting to withdraw funding for other countries, as we've seen in the USAID cuts this year under Trump and Musk. So you can kind of see how a similar movement could arise now. Not saying it will, but that's just my little opinion. Yeah, and the really interesting thing is, the reason I've kind of always been fascinated with the third world, I guess, is that most people really misunderstand what it is. It is nothing to do with being a poor country. It is not a classification based on your country's GDP or anything like that. If it was, then why is Saudi Arabia in there? Yeah, it just fascinates me. And the fact that it's always used as an insult, if you search for it in certain places, e.g. X the everything gap, then you'll find people just using it as an insult against countries. And you'll find people use it about their own country. I saw someone on Reddit describe themselves as being from a third world country the other day and saying they were trying to go to America, or trying to go to a first world country, and how hard it is for them to do it. And I'm like, I don't see what benefit it gives you to describe yourself that way, but fine. But it's kind of become an insult, but it never was intended that way. And it was never used in that way when it was the real movement. It's only really in the last few decades that it's become an insult. I remember when I was a kid, it was always used as an insult in the 90s. Just a very interesting little slice of history that tells us a lot about the world as it was and as it is, and how that was only really possible in that real stretch of time, but then has become almost an idyllic dream since then. But what they were after wasn't really that radical. They just wanted to have a group of countries that worked together to avoid imperial powers. Not so bad, is it? Bye.